If you close your eyes and imagine yourself in a small medieval village, you may hear the sound of animals shuffling in their pens, the low hum of conversations in narrow lanes, and perhaps the bubbling of a pot sitting over the fire. That pot might not contain stew or porridge, it could very well be part of the brewing process. Beer, or more often ale, was not only a drink of choice in the Middle Ages, it was an essential element of daily survival. But why did people turn to this cloudy, often warm drink, when rivers, wells, and streams ran through their landscapes? The answer, while seemingly simple, unfolds slowly across centuries of habit, fear, necessity, and practice. In the Middle Ages, water was not trusted. It was not that medieval people did not understand thirst, nor that they had no access to water. Wells were dug, rivers ran past towns, and rain fell from the sky just as it does today. The issue was contamination. Most towns, especially as they grew crowded in the 13th and 14th centuries, did not have sophisticated sewage systems. Waste seeped into rivers, animals wandered freely through the streets, and latrines emptied near, or directly into, water sources. The dangers of drinking untreated water were not understood in terms of microbes or bacteria, for the germ theory of disease was still centuries away, but people knew from experience that drinking certain waters often led to sickness, stomach cramps, or even death. Beer and ale, on the other hand, offered something more consistent. The brewing process involved boiling. Even if medieval brewers did not grasp the science, the act of heating liquid to prepare the mash effectively killed many of the harmful pathogens present in raw water. Grains such as barley or wheat were soaked, boiled, and fermented, and what emerged was a liquid that was not only safer to drink but could also provide nourishment. It contained calories, small amounts of vitamins from the grain, and, depending on the strength, a gentle alcoholic content that acted as a preservative. Beer, unlike water, would not go stale or foul as quickly. You could store it, share it, and trust it. For the average villager, ale was not a luxury but part of a daily routine. Households brewed in small batches, often once a week, producing what was known as small beer. This was a weak ale, low in alcohol, consumed by adults and children alike. Stronger brews were reserved for special occasions or sold in markets and taverns, but the watery, lightly fermented small beer was a staple. Imagine waking up to bread and a mug of ale, taking a jug of it into the fields for the midday meal, and ending the evening with another. It was less a choice than a constant companion. The tools for brewing were simple: large pots for boiling, wooden barrels for storing, and earthenware jugs for pouring. Women, often referred to as alewives, were the primary brewers in their homes. Before beer became commercialized on a larger scale, brewing was part of domestic labor, as necessary as baking bread or making butter. Recipes varied from region to region, with local herbs sometimes used in place of hops, which only became common in Europe in the later Middle Ages. The result was a drink that could taste sour, herbal, or sweet, depending on the hand that made it and the ingredients available. No two brews were quite the same, yet all shared the role of being safer than the water outside. It is easy, perhaps, for us to romanticize medieval beer as something hearty and comforting, but in reality, it was often cloudy, unfiltered, and inconsistent. Sediment settled at the bottom, and the taste could shift within a few days. Barrels were heavy and leaked, while jugs broke easily. Yet, despite its flaws, ale was dependable in the one way that mattered most: it quenched thirst without bringing illness. In a world where so much was uncertain, harvests, weather, survival itself, this predictability made it indispensable. Water, however, was not entirely abandoned. Fresh springs and deep wells, particularly in rural areas, could provide clean water, and people did drink from them. But the memory of bad experiences lingered. Stories of bad water circulated through communities, reinforcing the idea that beer was safer. In towns, especially where human and animal waste contaminated the surroundings, these suspicions were justified. Without filtration systems, aqueducts, or the scientific understanding of disease, trial and error guided choices. Beer survived this trial, water did not. You might ask yourself, how did brewing become so embedded in everyday life if it required such effort? The answer lies not only in safety but in habit and culture. Children were raised on small beer, farmers carried it to their work, monks brewed it within monasteries for sustenance during fasts. Beer was stitched into the rhythm of existence, a backdrop to every meal, transaction, and gathering. Brewing was taught, passed down, and expected, much like any household skill. To not brew, or to not drink, would have been an oddity. As you picture the slow bubbling of a brewing pot, the steam rising in a low-ceilinged cottage, and the smell of damp grain filling the room, you can sense the ordinariness of it all. Nothing glamorous, nothing indulgent, just necessity turned into tradition. Beer was not a symbol of festivity, it was the background hum of medieval life. And yet, as much as beer answered the question of thirst, it left behind another puzzle. If water could sometimes be clean, if springs and wells could be relied upon, then why was the shift toward beer so complete, and why did it endure so stubbornly across centuries? Could it be that safety alone does not explain the dominance of beer in medieval Europe? If you lean closer to the rhythms of medieval life, you begin to see that ale was more than just a safe drink. It became a small economy in itself. A thread that connected households, neighbors, and entire towns. Brewing, once a domestic chore carried out in smoky kitchens, began to move slowly into public spaces, where it shaped livelihoods and community bonds. To understand why beer was not only drunk but relied upon so heavily, you must follow it into the markets, the taverns, and the records of medieval law. In the early Middle Ages, most brewing was done at home. A family might set aside a portion of their grain harvest for weekly brewing, sometimes mixing barley with oats or rye, sometimes adding herbs like yarrow or bog myrtle for flavoring. These household brews were shared with family, friends, and farmhands. But as towns grew in size and population density, the demand for beer outpaced the capacity of domestic brewing. It was not long before some households, often women, found themselves brewing extra, selling their surplus to neighbors, or setting up informal stalls. Thus, the alewife became a familiar figure in medieval society. Alewives occupied a peculiar place in the medieval imagination. They were sometimes praised for their skill, sometimes mocked in ballads or depicted in morality plays as dishonest or careless, watering down their ale or overcharging their customers. Yet despite this mixed reputation, they were indispensable. A village without an alewife was one where people had to return to water, or travel long distances for their drink. Town authorities, recognizing both the necessity and the risks of dishonesty, began regulating the sale of ale. By the 13th century, many English towns had official ale tasters, men tasked with inspecting the quality, strength, and fairness of beer sold in markets and taverns. Prices were recorded, and punishments for false measures could be severe. Beer had become not just a household necessity but a civic concern. Alongside alewives, another force entered the brewing world, the monasteries. Monks had long been associated with brewing, partly because monastic life involved strict fasting periods, during which meat and sometimes solid food were restricted. Beer, with its liquid calories and nourishing qualities, provided sustenance. Monastic breweries often produced beer of higher consistency and sometimes higher quality than domestic brews, and they did so on a larger scale. Some monasteries sold their surplus, making brewing both a spiritual practice and an economic one. The revenues funded charity, repairs, and the upkeep of the monastic community. This dual role of beer, feeding the body and sustaining the institution, cemented its centrality. As towns expanded and trade networks widened, beer itself began to travel. In Northern Europe, particularly in the Low Countries and the Hanseatic cities along the Baltic, large-scale brewing became a commercial enterprise. Towns like Hamburg, Bremen, and later Antwerp produced vast quantities of beer, exported across seas and rivers. Here, the introduction of hops changed the picture dramatically. Unlike Grut, herbs used to flavor early medieval Alesh, hops acted as a preservative. A hopped beer could last longer, withstand transport, and appeal to markets far from the place of brewing. By the 14th century, hopped beer from the Low Countries began spreading into England, Germany, and beyond, competing with and gradually overtaking traditional ale. The shift was not immediate. Many English drinkers resisted hopped beer for generations, describing it as bitter or foreign, but the efficiency of preservation and trade made its spread inevitable. This expansion reveals an important point: beer was not just about survival anymore. It was about exchange, profit, and identity. A small village might pride itself on its local ale, a town might build revenue on the taxes levied from its brewers. Kings and lords, always alert to sources of income, imposed duties on beer, creating streams of revenue for their treasuries. In some cases, taxes on beer became a significant portion of a town's income, funding walls, marketplaces, and even wars. What began as a safeguard against foul water had become a cornerstone of economic life. You may wonder how ordinary people navigated this transition. For many, little changed. They still brewed small beer at home, drank it daily, and gave it to their children. But increasingly, especially in towns, beer was purchased rather than made. Alehouses, taverns, and inns multiplied, offering not only drink but also a place for conversation, negotiation, and social interaction. These establishments were not rowdy dens of drunkenness in the way later centuries sometimes imagined them. Instead, they were extensions of the public square, a place where news traveled, where workers gathered at the end of a long day, where travelers found refreshment and companionship. The clink of wooden mugs was the background music of commerce and community. It is worth pausing on the role of children. To modern ears, the idea of children drinking beer may sound shocking, but in the Middle Ages, small beer contained little alcohol, sometimes less than 1%. Its purpose was hydration and nutrition, not intoxication. A child might drink ale with their porridge in the morning, or sip it with bread in the afternoon, with little more effect than a glass of milk would have today. Stronger beers, of course, were reserved for adults, but the culture of beer blurred the line between childhood and adulthood in terms of daily habits. Beer was simply the liquid of life, and everyone partook. One cannot overlook, however, the labor that went into this culture. Brewing required time, grain, and fuel for boiling, all of which represented precious resources. Grain diverted to brewing could not be used for bread, and fuel diverted to boiling mash could not heat the home. Families made constant calculations, weighing their needs against their supplies. In years of poor harvest, the brewing of beer became more difficult, and sometimes authorities restricted grain for brewing in favor of bread. These choices reveal the delicate balance of medieval survival, where even a trusted drink like beer was not immune to scarcity. By the 15th century, brewing had grown into an organized profession in many towns, with guilds, apprentices, and official rules. Brewing was no longer just a household skill, it was an occupation. The profession brought with it pride, status, and disputes over quality and price. It also introduced gender shifts. While women had dominated early domestic brewing, men increasingly controlled large-scale commercial brewing, particularly in cities. This transformation from household alewife to professional brewer mirrors a broader story in history: the movement of labor from domestic spaces into market economies, and the way gender roles shifted with it. So, as you sit with this long history, imagine the humble mug of ale in your hand. It is not only a drink but a record of work, exchange, and adaptation. From the small kitchens of peasants to the vaulted halls of monasteries, beer had become the drink of medieval life. But its importance went beyond hydration and nourishment. It entered rituals, identities, and even politics. If you trace its presence through the records of towns, households, and kingdoms, you begin to see how a simple, boiled, fermented grain liquid came to symbolize safety, familiarity, and belonging in a world where much else was unstable. To conclude this first story, let us look at how beer shaped culture, how it competed with water, and how its legacy stretched into the centuries that followed. One of the most striking features of medieval beer culture is how ordinary it was. Unlike wine, which carried connotations of luxury, status, and religion, especially in southern Europe, beer was not an indulgence. It was not a drink of ceremony but of necessity. A mason in a town, a farmer in the field, or a child at a wooden table all drank beer in the same way. They ate bread, daily, almost thoughtlessly. Yet within this ordinariness lay its cultural power. Beer connected classes. It was one of the few consumables that kings, monks, peasants, and children all shared, albeit in different qualities and strengths. That universality helped shape a shared cultural rhythm. Beer also became a marker of regional identity. In some places, local herbs continued to flavor ale long after hops had spread elsewhere. In England, the resistance to hopped beer gave rise to centuries of debate between ale and beer, with ale seen as the traditional, local, and familiar drink, while beer was foreign, bitter, and suspect. The terms sometimes overlapped, but the distinction carried meaning. To declare a preference for ale over beer, or vice versa, was not simply a matter of taste. It was a statement about belonging, about what it meant to be rooted in a place and its traditions. Through such choices, beer was woven into the cultural debates of identity and change. The tavern or alehouse also became a stage for community life. Here, villagers exchanged news, sealed bargains, and found companionship. Some alehouses gained reputations, not always good ones, for fostering disorder or idle gossip, but they were, more often than not, quiet centers of daily interaction. Imagine a dimly lit room with rough benches, the air heavy with smoke, and the steady sound of mugs being placed on wooden tables. Within such rooms, the weight of the day lifted, if only slightly, in shared company. These were not places of escape from life, but places where life's routines continued, lubricated by ale. The very ordinariness of beer gave it stability. You could rely on it to be there, just as you could rely on bread, and that reliability mattered deeply in a world where famine, disease, and war often interrupted everything else. Yet water never disappeared entirely. Deep wells in villages, clean springs in forests and carefully maintained conduits in some towns continued to supply drinkable water. In monastic records, water appears alongside beer as part of the daily ration. People knew that some water sources were good. What beer offered was not a replacement but a safer baseline. When uncertainty lingered, beer was the default. You might still drink water if you knew the spring was safe, but you could never be sure in crowded towns or after floods, when contamination spread. This lingering uncertainty meant beer endured even when water was available. Beer did not simply replace water, it absorbed its risks and outlasted its doubts. The reliance on beer also shaped medieval health. Physicians sometimes prescribed beer for certain ailments, especially when brewed with herbs. It was seen as strengthening, easier on the stomach than cold water, and useful in balancing the humors according to the medical theories of the time. Beer was not just a drink but a mild medicine, a daily dose of reassurance in liquid form. Even its weaknesses, its cloudiness, its sediment, were interpreted within the framework of humoral medicine, reinforcing the idea that beer belonged within the logic of health. By the late Middle Ages, beer's dominance was secure, but it carried with it the seeds of change. The shift from alewives to professional brewers altered gender roles. The taxation of beer entrenched its place in government finance. The spread of hopped beer reshaped trade routes and markets. And yet, at the heart of all these changes remained the same simple fact: beer was safer than much of the water. That foundation gave it resilience, ensuring that even when tastes changed, when hops triumphed, when governments taxed, when taverns grew rowdier, beer remained. Looking forward, beer's role in the Middle Ages left a long shadow. The habits established then, brewing in households, drinking daily, associating beer with safety and nourishment, echoed into the modern era. Even today, in many European countries, beer retains its image as a daily drink rather than a luxury. The idea that beer belongs to the table, not just the tavern, owes much to these medieval centuries. As this first story closes, you are left with a picture of a world where every household smelled faintly of boiling grain, where children drank mugs of small beer before heading to their tasks, where taverns echoed with quiet conversation, and where alewives stirred their pots as much for survival as for profit. It was a world where water was never entirely gone but was never fully trusted. And perhaps the most lingering question is this: if beer became the drink of necessity because of fear and habit, what might have changed if medieval people had understood germs and water purification centuries earlier? Would beer still have become the liquid heartbeat of Europe, or would it have remained only an occasional drink, a luxury instead of a lifeline? Picture yourself stepping into a medieval town at the end of a long workday. The narrow streets are lined with timbered houses, and the air carries the smell of smoke from hearths and the faint tang of malt drifting from open doors. People, tired from their labors, make their way toward a familiar place, the tavern or alehouse. For centuries, these establishments were the living rooms of towns and villages, where the business of drinking beer became the business of community. But beyond the mugs and benches lay an entire economy of brewing, selling, and regulating, one that quietly sustained the medieval world. The tavern was not the invention of the Middle Ages. Romans had their taberni, places where wine and food could be purchased, and early medieval Europe retained some of these traditions. But by the 13th century, as towns expanded and brewing became more professionalized, alehouses became a recognizable institution. They were simple structures, often just extensions of someone's home, where the brewer sold her own ale. The furnishings might be minimal: wooden benches, rough tables, and perhaps a fire, but the purpose was not luxury. It was accessibility. Beer was made to be shared, and alehouses made that sharing public. At the center of this world stood the alewife. Women dominated brewing in the early and high Middle Ages, and many of them extended their work beyond the household by opening alehouses. Their presence in records is so frequent that they became a symbol, sometimes celebrated as industrious, sometimes derided as deceitful. Town ordinances frequently mention alewives, regulating the strength of their beer, the honesty of their measures, and the cleanliness of their establishments. The very need for such regulation shows how integral they were. People depended on alewives not just for drink but for a place to gather. The monks, meanwhile, brought another dimension. Within monasteries, brewing was both sustenance and discipline. Monks followed rules of fasting, during which beer provided nourishment without breaking the letter of abstinence from food. Brewing also provided income. Monasteries sold surplus beer, which helped fund their charitable work and maintain their buildings. Unlike household brewers, monks had the advantage of resources, consistency, and organization. Some monasteries developed reputations for the quality of their beer, and in certain regions, monastic beer became a recognized brand centuries before the word brand existed. The balance of piety and practicality made monastic brewing distinctive, and its influence reached beyond cloisters into the wider economy. Taverns and monasteries were not competitors so much as parallel systems. Alehouses served daily needs, while monastic breweries often supplied larger markets or offered higher quality beer for special occasions. The two systems reinforced the ubiquity of beer. No matter where you turned, in your home, your street, or your place of worship, beer was there. But behind the comforting presence of beer lay constant negotiation. Authorities sought to control prices and measures, introducing official ale tasters whose job was to ensure fairness. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a series of regulations first recorded in 13th century England, set prices for beer in proportion to the cost of grain. If grain prices rose, ale could become weaker, but not more expensive. This kept beer affordable for the poor, but it also created tension between brewers and authorities. Records show fines levied against alewives for selling beer too weak, too strong, or at the wrong price. The everyday business of beer was thus entangled with law and order. This regulation also reveals beer's economic significance. It was not merely a drink but a taxable commodity. Kings and lords imposed levies, towns collected duties, and guilds enforced standards. The money from these taxes funded roads, walls, and defenses. What you drank in your mug contributed, indirectly, to the maintenance of the very town you lived in. Beer was not only personal sustenance but public infrastructure. To understand the quiet economy of medieval beer, imagine the flow of grain. Farmers grew barley or oats, sold them to brewers, who boiled, fermented, and distributed the product. Brewers sold to alehouses, or directly to customers, and money cycled back into markets. Taxes skimmed from each sale enriched town coffers. Every step in this chain depended on trust and regulation, but it also depended on habit. People drank beer daily, and their daily consumption created a steady rhythm of demand. Few medieval commodities were as constant. By the 14th century, beer had become such a fixture of economic life that entire guilds of brewers formed in cities like London, Ghent, and Cologne. These guilds established rules, trained apprentices, and defended the interests of their members. In doing so, they turned brewing into a recognized profession. The alewife remained common in villages, but in cities, large-scale brewing was increasingly male-dominated and tightly controlled. The shift from informal domestic work to guild-regulated labor reflected larger changes in medieval economies, as urbanization transformed how goods were made and sold. And so, when you picture the tavern filled with townsfolk at the end of the day, you are not only imagining a scene of relaxation. You are also seeing the surface of a much deeper structure, a network of brewers, sellers, regulators, and consumers who together sustained an economy. Beer was, in many ways, invisible as an economic force precisely because it was so ordinary. People thought of it as refreshment, but towns depended on it for revenue, and households depended on it for survival. This raises an intriguing question: if beer was so tightly woven into the fabric of daily and economic life, what happened in times of crisis, when grain ran short or regulation failed? How did the quiet economy of beer respond to the shocks of famine, war, and plague that swept across medieval Europe? When you step deeper into the history of medieval beer, you realize it was not just a daily comfort but also a barometer of crisis. In a world often racked by famine, war, and disease, beer both reflected and absorbed the shocks of instability. Its quiet economy was built on routines of grain harvests, brewing, and consumption, but whenever those routines faltered, the cracks spread quickly across households, taverns, and towns. To understand how central beer was, one must watch what happened to it when ordinary life fell apart. Grain lay at the heart of the problem. Every mug of beer began in the fields, where barley and oats were sown, tended, and harvested. In years of abundance, grain supplied both bread and beer, filling tables and mugs alike. But in years of poor harvest, whether caused by bad weather, war, or blight, difficult choices had to be made. Bread, as the staple of survival, usually came first. Authorities often restricted or even banned brewing in lean years, reasoning that no grain could be spared for beer until there was enough for bread. For households accustomed to daily ale, these restrictions must have felt like a further deprivation layered onto hunger. The absence of beer meant not only thirst but also the loss of a small comfort in bleak times. Taverns and alehouses reflected these shortages immediately. Prices fluctuated, sometimes steeply, as the quality and quantity of beer declined. Ale tasters and town officials tried to enforce the rules, but scarcity often overwhelmed regulation. Complaints of watered-down beer, weak brews, or unfair measures multiplied in the records. For alewives, these were dangerous times. Accusations of fraud or cheating were easier to make when beer tasted thin. Yet, in truth, they were often brewing with whatever grain they could secure, balancing survival against reputation. The struggle of famine was written into every barrel. Monasteries faced their own challenges. Their larger fields and better resources meant they often weathered shortages more successfully than villagers, but they were not immune. In some cases, monasteries became important suppliers of beer during crisis, distributing surplus to communities or selling at reduced rates. In others, they withdrew behind their walls, preserving their supplies for their own survival. How monasteries responded often shaped local experiences of famine. A generous monastery could soften the blow, a withdrawn one could sharpen resentment. Either way, beer was central to how the crisis was perceived and managed. The arrival of plague in the mid-14th century introduced a different disruption. The Black Death killed millions across Europe, collapsing populations, shattering families, and leaving fields untended. Brewing, like every other trade, faltered. Alehouses closed as entire households died or fled. Monasteries, once centers of brewing stability, suffered massive losses of monks, disrupting their production. Yet in the long aftermath, when survivors rebuilt their communities, beer returned quickly. In some ways, it became even more important. With labor scarce and wages rising, people sought the comfort of familiar drinks in taverns. Alehouses became meeting places for survivors, where grief mingled with attempts at normalcy. The simple act of sharing a mug of beer was a way of stitching life back together. War brought its own strain. Armies on the march consumed vast amounts of beer, draining supplies from towns and villages. Soldiers expected beer as part of their rations, just as they expected bread. To meet these demands, authorities sometimes requisitioned grain or commandeered breweries, forcing local people to surrender their supplies. For civilians, this meant shortages, higher prices, and resentment. The presence of war thus echoed in the tavern as much as in the battlefield. Beer was not just a civilian necessity, it was a military one, a reminder that no part of medieval life was untouched by conflict. Yet despite all these shocks, famine, plague, war, beer proved remarkably resilient. Unlike luxuries, which disappeared in times of hardship, beer always returned. Its survival lay in its ordinariness. People rebuilt brewing because they could not imagine life without it. Even when restrictions forced households to drink less, the habit never disappeared. Brewing skills passed down through families ensured that once grain was available again, beer followed quickly. Alehouses reopened, monks returned to their kettles, and the smell of malt once more drifted through towns. Still, the crises of the Middle Ages left lasting marks on the beer economy. Scarcity and uncertainty encouraged the growth of regulation and taxation. Town authorities tightened control, not only to protect consumers but also to stabilize revenues during unstable times. Some towns formalized brewing guilds more rigorously, ensuring that beer production could continue even under strain. Monasteries, too, expanded their role, often emerging stronger from crises as their stability gave them an edge over household brewers. Gradually, the brewing economy became less domestic and more professional, a change accelerated by hardship. At the same time, cultural attitudes toward beer deepened. Its role in comfort became clearer during crises. It was not merely drink but reassurance. To sit in a tavern with neighbors after a plague wave had passed, or to drink small beer at home during a lean year, was to cling to continuity in a world that felt fragile. Beer became a symbol of persistence, a daily ritual that outlasted disaster. This symbolic weight made it even harder for water to regain ground. In times of crisis, you trusted what you knew, and what people knew was beer. As you picture this world of shortages and shocks, imagine the tavern's wooden benches scarred by years of use, the mugs worn smooth by countless hands, the room dim with smoke. Even in the hardest years, people gathered here, seeking not escape but continuity. Beer, weak or strong, thin or hearty, carried them through. But this resilience raises a further question: as beer grew more professionalized, regulated, and taxed in response to crisis, what did that mean for the alewives who once dominated brewing? Did they retain their place, or did the quiet economy of beer begin to slip from their hands? By the later Middle Ages, soap had found its way into nearly every corner of daily life, though in very different forms depending on class and region. In rural villages, families made coarse soap at home from ashes and fat. This soap was rarely stored in neat blocks. Instead, it might appear as soft paste in a wooden container, scooped out when needed. People used it sparingly, not for daily hand washing as we imagine today, but for major cleaning tasks, washing heavy wool, scrubbing cooking pots, or preparing cloth for dyeing. The idea of a bathroom shelf lined with scented soaps would have been unimaginable to most medieval households that in larger towns and port cities. Soap making became an organized craft. Guilds regulated the practice, setting rules on quality, price, and the location of workshops. Marseille, in southern France, became famous for its olive oil soap, which by the 14th century was already traded across the Mediterranean. Italian cities like Genoa and Venice also developed reputations for their refined soaps, exporting to northern Europe. For urban soap makers, soap was not only a product of cleanliness but also a commodity of commerce. Its trade reveals how something so seemingly dull connected households to broader economic systems. Soap making was not glamorous. The smell of boiling animal fat and caustic lye clung to workshops, so many towns restricted soap boilers to specific quarters, often near tanners and butchers. These trades shared a reputation for unpleasant odors. Yet, despite the nuisance, soap was valued enough to be tolerated. Its usefulness outweighed the discomfort it caused. Even complaints about its harshness, some soaps could irritate or even burn skin if lye content was too high, did not stop its use, because no better alternative existed. In an age when medical understanding was based on humors and balance, soap was sometimes recommended for treating skin ailments. Physicians and apothecaries occasionally prescribed soap for conditions like scabies or lice, believing its cleansing nature could drive away impurities. Washing with soap was also linked, in certain religious communities, with notions of purity and moral cleanliness. Though medieval people did not fully understand germs, they associated washing with spiritual and physical well-being. By the end of the Middle Ages, soap making had moved beyond small villages into a recognized urban industry. Trade routes carried soap across Europe, and taxes were sometimes levied on its production, showing its economic importance. Over the centuries, especially with the introduction of purer ingredients and chemical refinements, soap gradually transformed from a rough, gray block to the smoother, milder bars closer to what we know today. Looking back, soap may seem unremarkable, even boring. Yet it was essential. It shaped trade routes, sustained guilds, and connected households across social classes. Its very presence tells us that medieval people, though living without modern conveniences, were attentive to the tasks of cleaning and maintaining their world. What began as a mixture of ashes, fat, and water became a foundation for hygiene that continues into the present day, and so, we are left with a final thought. In an age where many of us take soap for granted, lining bathroom shelves with colorful, scented varieties, can we truly imagine what life would have been like without that humble, gray, unpleasant-smelling block of medieval soap? When the sun dipped below the horizon in the Middle Ages, the world quickly became a place of shadows. Darkness fell earlier in winter, stretching out long hours when homes, workshops, and churches had to rely on whatever source of light could be mustered. Today, you might flick a switch without a second thought, filling a room with bright, steady light. But in medieval Europe, the simple act of having light after sunset was the result of labor, resources, and careful choices. At the heart of this struggle for light was the humble candle. Candles, though seemingly ordinary, were essential. They illuminated manuscripts copied by monks in scriptoriums, lit the halls of great feasts, guided travelers through dim corridors of castles, and allowed families in peasant cottages to stretch their working hours a little further into the night. But unlike the modern paraffin candles you find in shops, medieval candles were made from two primary substances, tallow and beeswax. Each material carried its own challenges, costs, and associations. Tallow candles were the most common, especially among ordinary people. Tallow is rendered animal fat, often from sheep or cattle. After slaughtering, the fat was boiled down, impurities skimmed off, and the liquid cooled until it formed a waxy, greasy substance. The smell was unmistakable, pungent, acrid, and lingering long after the candle was extinguished. When burned, tallow candles released smoke and odor, filling small rooms with an air many found unpleasant. Yet they were cheap, accessible, and could be produced at home. For peasants and even many townsfolk, tallow candles were the only realistic option. Beeswax candles, by contrast, were a luxury. Made from the wax produced by bees, these candles burned brighter, cleaner, and with a sweet, natural scent. Unlike tallow, beeswax did not drip or smoke as heavily, making it ideal for use in enclosed spaces. Its steady flame made it perfect for churches and monasteries, where long hours of chanting or reading required consistent light. Beeswax candles became closely associated with religious devotion. Their expense, however, meant that few outside the clergy and wealthy households could afford them. In fact, in many churches, laws required the use of beeswax candles for altars, reinforcing the link between divine worship and the higher purity of beeswax. The making of candles was both simple and tedious. For tallow candles, the wick, often a twisted strand of hemp or flax, was repeatedly dipped into melted fat. After each dip, the wick was cooled and hardened before being dipped again, gradually building up a thick layer of tallow. This process could take hours, especially when producing multiple candles. Beeswax candles were often molded instead, as the wax could be poured into forms or rolled into sheets around the wick. Either method required patience and attention, as uneven layers or poorly prepared wicks would lead to a weak, sputtering flame. Candles were more than just functional objects, they measured time. In monasteries, the burning of candles marked hours of prayer through the night. In towns, officials sometimes gauged curfews or nighttime duties by how much of a candle had burned down. A candle's slow consumption was, in a way, a medieval clock. To run out of candles before dawn was to be left in darkness, a reminder of how fragile and costly artificial light truly was. But candles were not the only option. Oil lamps, fueled by olive oil or fish oil, were common in certain regions, particularly around the Mediterranean. Yet in Northern Europe, where olive oil was scarce and expensive, tallow and beeswax remained the standard. Light was always tied to resources, and so the geography of medieval Europe shaped the very way people saw the night. That if you imagine a medieval home at dusk, you can picture the quiet moment when a candle was lit. The room glowed faintly, shadows flickering against rough wooden walls. A family might sit close to one another, conserving their light, careful not to waste it unnecessarily. A single candle could mean the difference between a productive evening of mending tools and an early retreat into darkness. Light was never taken for granted. And so, in the glow of these modest flames, we find ourselves wondering, in an age where darkness was a daily challenge, how did candles become more than just tools of survival? How did they grow into symbols of wealth, devotion, and even time itself? As medieval towns expanded and commerce grew, candle-making evolved from a household chore into a recognized trade. Candle makers, known as chandlers, established workshops where they produced candles in larger quantities. In many cities, chandlers became organized into guilds, much like bakers, weavers, or smiths. These guilds regulated the quality of candles, fixed prices, and ensured that members followed established methods. It might seem odd to imagine rules written down for something as ordinary as candle making, yet such regulations reflect just how essential candles were to daily life. A poorly made candle, one that dripped too much, smoked heavily, or burned unevenly, was more than an annoyance. It was wasted time, wasted fat, and wasted light. Light was expensive. A household might spend a significant portion of its budget acquiring the materials for candles, especially during the long winter months. Records from manorial estates and urban inventories show that candles were carefully counted, stored, and rationed. In wealthier homes, servants were instructed to extinguish candles as soon as they were no longer needed, ensuring nothing was wasted. The poor often made do with rushlights, thin reeds dipped in grease, which burned quickly and unevenly, producing more smoke than light. Compared to beeswax candles in cathedrals, these simple rushlights underline the stark differences between classes, revealed in something as basic as illumination. Nowhere were candles more important than in the church. The flickering of dozens, even hundreds of beeswax candles, created an atmosphere of reverence in great cathedrals. They were not only sources of light but also symbols of divine presence. Candles were lit during Mass, at funerals, and on feast days, carrying spiritual meaning as much as practical use. For the clergy, the brightness and purity of beeswax represented holiness, separating sacred spaces from the ordinary world of smoky, greasy tallow candles. Donating candles to a church became a common form of piety, with wealthy patrons leaving behind funds or specific requests for candles to burn in their memory long after death. In towns like London or Paris, chandlers' guilds gained privileges that extended beyond candle making. Some were permitted to sell oil, soap, or other household goods. Their shops often smelled of fat, smoke, and wax, filled with bundles of tallow candles stacked for common sale and carefully guarded supplies of beeswax reserved for wealthier clients. Apprentices learned the trade slowly, dipping wicks again and again into molten tallow, or carefully molding wax into uniform shapes. The skill was less in artistry and more in patience, repetition, and precision. Candles were also communal objects. In some villages, neighbors gathered at specific times of year to render fat and produce a batch of candles together, sharing both the labor and the results. Candlelight lit guild feasts, market stalls in the darker months, and even court proceedings held in the evening. Public gatherings after sunset required light, and candles provided a practical way to extend community life beyond daylight hours. Even here, light reinforced social order, who could afford beeswax, who relied on tallow, and who managed only with smoky rushlights. By this period, candles had also taken on a new role, measuring time. Candle clocks appeared, in which the slow, predictable burning of a candle could mark the passage of hours. Sometimes, nails were inserted into the side of a candle so that, as the wax melted, the nail would drop into a metal pan with a clang, signaling the passing of a set interval. Though imprecise by modern standards, such clocks were useful for monasteries and households alike. Another way that the slow destruction of a candle shaped the rhythms of daily life. The more closely we look at the candle in this era, the more its significance grows. No longer just a lump of fat and wick, it was a product of labor, a measure of time, a symbol of piety, and a reflection of wealth. And yet, the question remains, as the Middle Ages drew to a close, how would candles evolve further, balancing between necessity, devotion, and a slow march toward the modern world of light? By the 15th century, Europe was slowly changing. Trade expanded, cities grew, and new ideas spread with the rise of printing. Yet, despite all these transformations, one daily fact of life remained unchanged. Once the sun set, people turned to candles. Whether in the cottage of a peasant or the chambers of a wealthy merchant, candles marked the boundary between daylight and night. They were no longer just a household craft or a guild product, they had become woven into the rhythms of European life. Even at the end of the Middle Ages, the difference between tallow and beeswax candles remained a marker of status. Nobles and wealthy townsfolk filled their halls with beeswax candles, their clean light reflecting off tapestries and polished wood. For them, candlelight was part of hospitality and grandeur. Guests arriving for a feast might see dozens of candles blazing at once, each flame a small display of wealth. For the poor, the evening was lit by a single tallow candle or rushlight, the smoky glow barely enough to mend clothing or prepare tools for the next day. Light was never equal, it reflected social order as clearly as clothing or food. In monasteries, monks still read, prayed, and copied texts by the steady glow of beeswax candles. In towns, chandlers continued to produce tallow for ordinary sale, often side by side with soap making, since both relied on rendered fat. In villages, families rendered their own tallow in autumn after slaughtering livestock, storing candles for winter months. Candlelight structured evenings everywhere, marking curfews, illuminating courts, or guiding a traveler through dark streets. By the late Middle Ages, experimentation in candle making was already pointing toward future change. Some chandlers began mixing different fats to improve burn quality. Others experimented with braided wicks, which burned more evenly and did not need constant trimming. These small improvements might seem minor, but they reflect the constant human effort to tame darkness, to extend the hours of the day, and to find steadier, brighter light. Candles remained more than just tools. They carried symbolic meaning into rituals, both religious and domestic. Families lit candles on feast days, in memory of the dead, or during celebrations of marriage and birth. In churches, their flames symbolized the divine, and in courts, they illuminated law and order. Even as oil lamps and, eventually, new forms of lighting appeared, the candle retained a special place in cultural imagination. It was not only light but memory, prayer, and presence. When we look back on the Middle Ages, we often focus on castles, battles, or kings. Yet the candle, humble, greasy, and ordinary, tells another story. It speaks of the slow work of chandlers, of households counting each stub to make it last, of monasteries glowing through the night, and of vast cathedrals filled with beeswax light. Candles remind us that history is not only about power and conquest but also about the small, flickering details that made survival and community possible. And so, as the Middle Ages gave way to the modern era, one might wonder, in a world where electricity has erased the struggle for light, do we still appreciate the quiet endurance of those tiny flames that once held back the vast darkness of night? It is difficult for us today to imagine a world without soap powders neatly sealed in bright cardboard boxes, or washing machines quietly turning in the corner of a home. In the medieval centuries, laundry was not a background task done with the press of a button, but rather a long, exhausting, and deeply physical chore. It was not a single action that could be completed in a morning. Instead, it unfolded across entire days, and often involved whole households, groups of women, and even entire communities, all bound by the slow rhythm of water, cloth, and ash. To understand how medieval people washed their clothes, we must begin with their materials. Linen was the most common fabric for undergarments and household cloths, while wool was frequently used for outerwear. Both behaved differently when washed. Linen, made from flax, could withstand soaking, boiling, and beating. Wool, on the other hand, had to be handled gently, lest it shrink or felt. Every laundry session was therefore a negotiation with the material world, which cloth could take harsh treatment, and which needed careful handling. The primary ingredient for washing was not soap as we think of it today, but lye, a strong alkaline solution obtained from ashes. Housewives and laundresses collected the ashes left over from their hearth fires. These ashes, once sifted, were placed into barrels or large tubs. Hot water was poured over them, and the liquid that drained through carried a caustic property. This lye water could break down grease and loosen dirt. For centuries, it was the fundamental chemical tool of the washer's art, but lye was not the only solution employed. In urban centers, particularly where tanners and fullers worked, stale human urine was another essential ingredient. Its ammonia content made it an effective cleaner. It was gathered in jars left in doorways, or purchased from collectors who made their rounds. While the idea may repel modern sensibilities, in the practical world of the Middle Ages, such a substance was valuable and not wasted. Clothes destined for particularly deep cleaning or stain removal might spend hours soaking in a vat of urine before being rinsed and beaten. Once the cloth had been prepared with lye or urine, the process of physical cleansing began. Washing was almost always done near abundant water. Rivers, streams, ponds, and specially dug washing pits provided the essential resource. Women would gather at these sites, bending over stones or wooden boards set into the bank. The garments were lifted, beaten against flat stones, twisted, wrung, and then beaten again. The sound of laundry at work was rhythmic, a steady slap of cloth against stone, the gurgle of water, the murmuring voices of women at their shared labor. This labor was backbreaking, yet it carried a social aspect. At the washing place, women exchanged news, gossip, and stories. The slow hours of soaking, scrubbing, and wringing were softened by conversation. Children sometimes played nearby, splashing in the shallows, or carrying smaller items to and fro. Yet the work itself could not be avoided or hurried. To clean a single household's linens might take the better part of a day. For estates, monasteries, or castles, laundry days extended into great communal efforts involving numerous hands. Drying was another stage that required patience. Clean garments were spread across bushes, hedges, or ropes. In some places, communal drying fields existed, where sheets and shirts fluttered together under the sun. But medieval Europe was not always generous with weather. Rain meant damp clothes, which could mildew. Winter meant freezing air, where laundry stiffened into boards. In such seasons, drying by the hearth became necessary, with steaming linen draped across benches or pegged near smoky fires. The cycle of washing was slow and deliberate. Clothes were not laundered weekly, nor even monthly, in the way we might imagine. Linen undergarments, worn closest to the skin, absorbed sweat and dirt, and thus were washed more regularly. Outer garments, especially woolen cloaks or gowns, might go unwashed for seasons, brushed clean with care, or aired out in the sun. Washing too often was seen as both unnecessary and dangerous to the fabric's longevity. For great households, the labor of laundry was organized. In castles and monasteries, laundresses were a recognized class of servants. They oversaw the gathering of materials, ashes, water, tubs, and the handling of garments. In written records, we find mention of lavandières, women employed solely for this endless work. Their tasks were as vital to the functioning of daily life as cooking or farming, yet they often labored unseen, bending over troughs and riversides. The tools of their trade were simple: wooden tubs, scrubbing boards of rough-hewn planks, paddles for beating clothes, and great cauldrons for boiling. A sheet might be laid across a board, scrubbed with ash paste, and then dunked again. The boiling stage, particularly for linens, was harsh but effective. Great pots stood upon iron tripods over roaring fires, with steam rising into the rafters. Clothes boiled within, whitened by the strength of heat and lye. The physical toll was considerable. Backs ached from bending. Hands reddened from alkaline water and winter cold. Skin cracked under exposure. Yet despite the hardship, laundry was non-negotiable. Clean linens were a mark of order and decency. Priests preached sermons using the metaphor of spotless garments for purity of soul. Royal households expected a supply of fresh linen for feasts and ceremonies. Even peasants, though their resources were fewer, strove to keep their household cloths clean enough to pass muster. Laundry in medieval Europe was not simply a household task performed whenever one felt like it. Instead, it was governed by cycles of necessity, availability of water, weather, and tradition. In many regions, great wash days were appointed, often tied to the changing of seasons or to the feast days of saints. These events turned the act of washing from an individual burden into a shared responsibility and, sometimes, a communal gathering that resembled a modest festival of labor. Households, especially in villages, rarely attempted major laundry more than a few times a year. Smaller rinsing of undergarments might occur weekly, but the great piles of linens, sheets, tablecloths, tunics, cloaks, were saved until a proper wash day was declared. This was partly due to the enormous effort required to prepare the ash lye, fetch the water, heat the cauldrons, and secure enough hands for wringing and drying. It was also due to the strain such washing placed on the fabrics themselves. Cloth did not last long under repeated boiling and beating. Thus, the year was punctuated by these slow, demanding rituals of cleanliness. A noble household might appoint its laundresses to work before Easter, ensuring that garments and linens were fresh for the sacred celebrations. Villages often held their major laundry after the first thaw of spring, when the rivers ran full again and the days lengthened. In monasteries, rules about laundry were surprisingly strict. Monks and nuns were to keep their habits presentable, though not to indulge in luxury. Their laundresses, therefore, worked to a steady rhythm of regular washings dictated by the abbot or abbess. The preparation for a great wash day could take days. Ashes had to be collected from hearths and carefully sifted to remove cinders. Large barrels or tubs were set aside to brew the lye solution. Water, in astonishing quantities, had to be fetched from wells, rivers, or cisterns. In a large household, servants spent hours hauling bucket after bucket, filling vats where clothes would soak. Firewood was stacked in towering piles, for the boiling of water consumed logs without mercy. In some villages, people worked together to gather resources. One family contributed extra ashes, another lent a cauldron, while neighbors shared labor. Communal washing places often stood at the edge of the village, beside the main stream or pond. Here, broad stones were set into the earth, and wooden scaffolds supported ropes or racks for drying. Women arrived early in the morning, bearing baskets of soiled clothes on their heads or backs. The sight of a procession of laundresses, skirts tucked up, arms burdened with linen, was a familiar one in the countryside. The process itself demanded coordination. One group of women managed the soaking stage, immersing linen into tubs filled with lye water. They stirred the garments with wooden paddles, pressing the liquid deep into the fibers. Another group tended the great cauldrons, ensuring that the boiling water remained at the proper heat, skimming off the froth, and feeding the flames with logs. The strongest among them performed the beating, lifting heavy sheets from the water and slapping them against stones or planks. The sound of these strikes echoed across the washing ground, mingled with the calls of birds and the murmurs of conversation. Others wrung out smaller items by hand, twisting the cloth until water gushed away. Children fetched and carried, while older women offered guidance and rhythm to the work. Despite the monotony, there was also a kind of camaraderie. As arms grew weary and backs ached, stories were told, songs were sung, and gossip passed freely. The washing place became a hub of information: who was courting whom, who had quarreled, who had prospered, and who had fallen ill. In a world without newspapers, the laundresses were keepers of the village chronicle. The sheer physical labor cannot be overstated. To boil a single load of linen required lifting gallons of water, bending constantly, and enduring both heat and cold. In summer, the sun baked exposed backs and necks. In winter, icy water numbed hands until fingers stiffened and cracked. The alkaline lye burned skin, leaving red patches and sores. Clothing was heavy when soaked, and lifting it from tub to stone to rope demanded strength akin to a farmer's plowing or a smith's hammering. Contemporary illustrations sometimes show laundresses with their skirts hitched high, muscles tense, arms raised mid-swing as they beat cloth against boards. These were not delicate figures of leisure, but hardy laborers whose survival depended upon endurance. Many developed chronic pains and ailments, yet the work continued, generation after generation. While the physical side was grueling, the social side held its own weight. Laundry was not only women's work, though it was most commonly so. Men occasionally joined in larger estates, particularly when sheer strength was required for hauling or beating. In monastic communities, brothers and sisters shared the labor, seeing it as a discipline as well as a necessity. In towns and cities, professional laundresses formed guild-like associations. They offered services to households that could afford to pay. Regulations sometimes governed their work, forbidding them from washing certain fabrics or charging unfair prices. Court records occasionally preserved disputes between laundresses and clients, testifying to the importance of their role. At the village level, however, laundry remained a communal rhythm. The washing ground was a place where reputations were shaped. A woman who shirked her turn, who failed to bring her share of ashes or water, was remembered and spoken of. Conversely, one who labored tirelessly earned respect. In this way, laundry functioned as both necessity and subtle social glue. Beyond practicality, laundry carried symbolic overtones. Clean linen was not only hygienic but moral. Medieval sermons often used laundry as metaphor: the soul soiled by sin, the purifying wash of confession, the whitening of cloth as a sign of grace. The act of cleansing thus resonated spiritually. In certain regions, beliefs surrounded the wash water itself. Water used for the first rinsing was thought to carry away impurity and should not be carelessly spilled near fields or wells. Some folk practices used leftover lye water in protective charms. Even the act of hanging clothes could carry omens. Garments flapping wildly in unexpected winds might be read as a sign of change to come. By evening, when clothes hung in long rows, steaming in the cool air, the laundresses were exhausted. Yet their task was not finished. Once dry, the garments had to be folded, stored, or returned to households. Stains that remained had to be scrubbed again. And the next season, the whole cycle would return. In truth, medieval laundry was never finished. Every day brought new stains, new dirt, new needs. The rhythm of ash, water, and cloth was as endless as the turning of the seasons. In the great castles of medieval Europe, laundry was a task both essential and invisible. Lords and ladies, clothed in silks, wools, and linens, rarely considered the labor behind their garments' cleanliness. Yet beneath the splendor of tapestries and banquets, an army of servants ensured that fine cloth did not descend into filth. The laundry room, if such a space was designated, was often tucked away in the lower courtyards or outer buildings. Here, laundresses tended to the sheets, table linens, and undergarments of the household. Unlike the peasantry, nobles possessed multiple sets of linens, allowing for rotation. Yet this abundance did not lessen the burden, it multiplied it. A noble feast could soil dozens of tablecloths in a single evening. Bedchambers with their layers of sheets required frequent changing. Guests arriving meant fresh linens at short notice. The methods remained the same: soaking in ash lye, boiling in cauldrons, and beating on stones. But the scale demanded constant cycles. Great baskets, woven from willow or hazel, moved endlessly between hall and washing yard. Servants carried them in teams, shoulders bent under the weight. To ensure whiteness, laundresses sometimes used chalk or fuller's earth, rubbing it into cloth to brighten fibers. They hung garments across castle courtyards, where fluttering sheets created an almost festive appearance, though to those laboring, it was far from joyous. Rain could undo a day's effort, soaking cloth before it dried, forcing repetition of the entire process. In monasteries, laundry acquired spiritual resonance. Clean habits symbolized discipline, humility, and devotion. Rules varied by order, but many required weekly washing of undergarments and regular renewal of habits. Monks and nuns often performed their own washing, though in larger houses designated lay brothers or sisters managed the bulk of the work. The setting was austere. Monastic laundries, known as lavatoria, stood near cloisters or rivers. These structures channeled water through stone basins, allowing for soaking and rinsing. The sound of running water became part of the monastic soundscape, mingling with chants and bells. Washing in a monastery was done without chatter or gossip. Silence was expected, turning the mundane act into a form of meditation. Each motion, lifting cloth, pouring lye, scrubbing stains, was considered part of one's discipline, a bodily service offered to God. Some texts even equated the cleansing of garments with the cleansing of the soul. Yet, despite this piety, the same struggles persisted. Cold water numbed fingers, heavy robes took days to dry. In winter, ice formed on garments stiff as wood. Monks wrote of the hardship in passing, though rarely complaining openly. Laundry, in this sense, became another layer of ascetic endurance. Towns and cities created a different landscape for laundry. Here, water sources were controlled, sometimes taxed, and space was scarce. Wells stood in crowded squares, and rivers carried refuse as often as they carried clarity. Professional laundresses thus became essential. These women, often widows or wives supplementing household income, washed clothes for clients across the social spectrum. They advertised their trade openly, shouting in markets or displaying cloth to show their skill. Payment was modest, coins, bread, or scraps of cloth, but steady. Some cities recognized their importance formally. Laundresses formed associations, agreeing on prices, setting standards, and protecting members from unfair competition. Records from Paris and London note disputes brought before civic courts, accusations of lost garments, of overcharging, or of negligence. The very presence of these records demonstrates that laundry was not a hidden task but a visible trade woven into urban life. Urban laundresses worked at riversides, kneeling on planks, their arms red from cold. They often carried great bundles through streets, a familiar sight to townsfolk. Satirical poems of the era mocked them as loud and quarrelsome, but also acknowledged their resilience. Without them, city life would have been far more foul. Drying was as crucial as washing. Improper drying left cloth musty, prone to rot. In villages, sheets hung across hedges or wooden frames. In castles, they draped along courtyard ropes, fluttering like banners. In towns, rooftops and alleyways served as drying grounds, the sight of linen above narrow lanes both ordinary and oddly picturesque. Once dry, garments had to be folded or rolled carefully. Large chests lined with cedar or herbs stored linens, protecting them from moths. Lavender, rosemary, and wormwood were common, their scents mingling with cloth. Nobles demanded precise folding, with sheets stacked neatly to display order. Repair followed naturally. Washing revealed tears and frayed hems. Seamstresses mended holes, patched elbows, and reinforced seams. Laundry, therefore, was not a single act but part of a cycle of care, washing, drying, repairing, storing, and, inevitably, repeating that in all these settings, castle, monastery, and town, laundry represented the invisible foundation of medieval life. Without it, garments decayed, illness spread, and dignity faltered. Yet it remained the domain of those rarely praised, servants, monks, widows, washerwomen. Their labor left little trace in chronicles of kings and battles, but it shaped the texture of daily existence. The whiteness of a noble's shirt, the plain neatness of a monk's robe, the respectable appearance of a townsman's tunic, all testified to hours of backbreaking labor by unseen hands. And so we might ask, when we imagine medieval history, filled with knights and abbots, feasts and processions, how often do we pause to consider the endless rhythm of soap, water, and cloth that made such images possible? Without those rhythms, would the pageantry of the Middle Ages have seemed so splendid?